He stood at the end of the aisle with his jaw tight and his hands folded like he was closing a book on me. "I won't walk you down," he said loud enough for half the room to hear, and the guests inhaled as if waiting for the sentence to finish me. My veil fogged my vision. My future husband reached for my hand, while my father looked past him as if he were invisible. The title I'll never stop saying in my head is the one that plays before everything else. My father refused to walk me down the aisle because I married poor. He watched my husband on the cover of Forbes. My name is Yoni Marlowe, and in that split second I felt something old and raw break inside me. Not just the humiliation of being rejected at my wedding, but the memory of a lifetime of being measured by bank balances instead of love. I remember every small humiliation that led to that aisle, the whispered lectures about better prospects, the way my father folded his hands when I spoke about choosing joy over stability. The wedding march had barely started when my father stepped back from where we stood at the church entrance. "I can't do this," he muttered, his voice low but clear. The whispers spread through the pews like wildfire. Guests turned in their seats with shocked faces. The photographer froze mid-lens, her camera hanging uselessly around her neck. My hand went cold around my bouquet of white roses. "You're marrying a man who can't even afford to buy your dress," he hissed, loud enough for the front row to hear every word. My grandmother gasped. My cousin covered her mouth. The flower girl, my niece, started crying without understanding why. My heart cracked in front of everyone I loved. The priest's silence was deafening as he stood at the altar, unsure whether to continue or stop the ceremony entirely. My name is Yoni Marlowe, and that was the day my father publicly disowned me for choosing love over status. I wore a dress I'd bought on sale with my own money from teaching piano lessons. Jonah, my fiancé, worked as a computer repair technician in a small shop downtown. He made enough to pay rent and buy groceries, but not enough to impress my father, a successful real estate developer who measured worth in property portfolios and luxury cars. I walked myself down the aisle after my father turned and left. My heels felt heavier than stone with each step on the white carpet. Jonah stood at the altar, steady and unflinching, his eyes locked on mine with a determination that kept me moving forward. Behind me, I heard my father's footsteps echoing as he walked out before the vows even began. The heavy church door closed with a thud that seemed to shake the walls. The photographer, bless her heart, caught the moment perfectly. Later, when I finally looked at the photos, I saw my father's back walking away down the center aisle, my mother's hand covering her face in shame, and me, standing tall even when I wanted to collapse and disappear, my white dress trailing behind me like a flag of rebellion, Jonah's face showing both pain for me and pride that I kept walking. The guests didn't know whether to clap or cry. Some did both. My best friend, sitting in the third row, gave me a tearful thumbs up. Jonah's mother dabbed her eyes with a tissue, smiling through her sadness. When I finally reached the altar and took Jonah's hands, he whispered, "You're the bravest person I've ever known." Those words held me together through the rest of the ceremony. The reception was held in a modest community center. We decorated ourselves with paper lanterns and borrowed tablecloths. The head table had a name card that read, "Father of the Bride," in elegant calligraphy my friend had carefully written. The chair stayed empty all night, a glaring reminder of my father's absence. Guests avoided looking at it, avoided asking about it, avoided mentioning the elephant in the room. My mother whispered apologies throughout the evening, her voice breaking with every word. "He'll come around," she kept saying, but we both knew she was lying to make herself feel better. She'd stayed for the ceremony and reception, but her eyes kept darting to the door as if expecting him to return and fix everything. He never did. Jonah squeezed my hand during our first dance and said, "We'll build our own family, one that measures love by loyalty, not money." I smiled for the wedding photographer, for our guests, for the video that would later be watched by strangers online. I pretended I wasn't shattered inside, that my father's rejection hadn't carved a hole in my chest that ached with every breath. But late that night, after we'd returned to our tiny apartment, I cried in Jonah's arms until dawn broke through our bedroom window. 2 days after the wedding, a package arrived at our apartment door. I recognized my father's handwriting on the label immediately. Inside was the wedding gift I'd given him years ago, a framed photo of us at my college graduation. I was wearing my cap and gown, and he had his arm around my shoulders, both of us smiling at the camera. It had sat on his desk for 3 years. Tucked inside the frame was a note written on his business stationery in his characteristic neat handwriting. "When you come to your senses, you'll find your way home." No signature, no love, just a cold dismissal wrapped in expensive paper. The implication was clear. He considered my marriage a temporary mistake, a phase I'd grow out of once reality set in and poverty became unbearable. I stood in our small living room, staring at that note for a long time. Jonah found me there when he came home from work, still holding the frame and the cruel words. Without saying anything, he took the note from my hand and tore it in half, then in quarters, then into tiny pieces that he threw in the trash. "Keep the photo," he said gently. "That's a memory of who you were. The note is just his fear talking." I kept the photo but never displayed it again. Jonah and I started our married life in a one-bedroom apartment on the 3rd floor of an old building with creaky stairs and thin walls. The place smelled like fresh paint because we'd spent our honeymoon weekend repainting the yellowed walls ourselves. It wasn't much, but it felt like hope. We furnished it with second-hand finds from thrift stores and hand-me-downs from friends who'd upgraded their own lives. Jonah worked long hours at the computer repair shop, coming home with his hands stained with thermal paste and his pockets full of tiny screws he'd forgotten to put back. I taught piano lessons to neighborhood kids in our living room, the old upright piano we'd bought for $200 taking up most of the space. We ate simple meals, rice and beans and laughter, sharing stories about our students and customers while sitting on our worn couch. But every night, when Jonah fell asleep beside me, I stared at the ceiling wondering if my father's words would come true. Would we always struggle? Would poverty wear us down until love wasn't enough? Would I someday regret choosing happiness over security? The questions haunted my midnight hours, though I never spoke them aloud. I was too proud, too stubborn, and too determined to prove my father wrong to admit my fears even to myself. My cousin uploaded our wedding video to social media a week later, thinking it would be a sweet memory to share. Instead, it went viral in ways none of us expected. Thousands of strangers watched and commented on the moment my father walked away. The video captured everything: his cold expression, my faltering steps, Jonah's steady presence, the shocked gasps from guests. Some commenters called my father's action honorable, saying he was protecting me from a life of hardship. Others called it cruel, arguing that real love meant supporting your children's choices even when you disagreed. The debate raged for days, spreading across platforms, with people taking sides and arguing about parental duty versus personal happiness. Our private pain became public entertainment. Jonah turned off the Wi-Fi that night after I spent hours reading comments that dissected my life and judged my choices. He held me while I cried quietly into his chest, my tears soaking through his worn t-shirt. "They don't know us," he whispered, stroking my hair. "They don't know what we're building. Let them argue about a moment while we build a lifetime." His words were medicine, but the wound still ached. Knowing strangers were debating whether I'd ruined my life hurt more than I wanted to admit. My father threw a dinner party about 6 weeks after my wedding. My mother told me about it during a brief phone call when he was out of the house. She overheard him boasting to his business associates that I'd regret this decision within a year. He'd apparently started a betting pool about when I'd come crawling back, asking for money or a divorce, whichever came first. I laughed bitterly when Mom relayed this information, though there was no humor in the sound. "He's timing my failure like it's a sporting event." The cruelty of it struck me hard. My own father was gambling on my unhappiness, placing bets on how quickly poverty would break me and send me running home with my tail between my legs. Jonah squeezed my hand across our small kitchen table and said firmly, "Then don't give him what he's waiting for." That conversation changed something in me. The hurt transformed into determination. The wound calcified into armor. If my father wanted to watch me fail, I'd make sure he watched me succeed instead. It became our unspoken mission, not driven by revenge, but by the simple, stubborn refusal to live down to his expectations. We would build something real and lasting, not to prove him wrong, but to prove ourselves right. I sent my parents a Christmas card that year, our first holiday as a married couple. The photo showed Jonah and me in front of our apartment building, smiling despite everything, wearing matching ugly Christmas sweaters we'd found at a thrift store. I wrote a simple message inside, "Wishing you peace and love this season, from Jonah and Yoni." The card came back 3 weeks later, returned to sender. Across the front, my handwriting had been crossed out with red ink in violent strokes that tore through the envelope. No note, no explanation, just rejection, literal and complete. My father had marked my words, my face, my existence with angry red lines that said clearer than any letter, "You're dead to me." Jonah found me sitting on the floor of our bedroom, holding that destroyed card and crying silently. He didn't say anything. He just sat down beside me and pulled me close. Later that night, he put the card in the drawer where we kept bills and dreams, what we called our someday drawer. "Someday," he said, "we'll look back at this and understand why it had to hurt this much first." I wanted to believe him, but that night belief felt impossible. Jonah's small repair shop was robbed one night in late January. Someone smashed the front window and stole thousands of dollars worth of equipment, computers waiting to be fixed, tools, everything of value. The insurance company dragged their feet on the payout, finding technicalities and loopholes to deny most of the claim. We lost nearly everything he'd worked to build over the past 3 years. When my father heard the news through relatives who still talked to both sides of the family, he sent one message through my mother. Just 3 words that she delivered in a whispered phone call. "Told you so." Those 3 words cut deeper than any lecture or argument ever could. The smug satisfaction in that simple message, the vindication he must have felt, the way he used our misfortune as proof of his wisdom. That line lit a fire in me that never went out. Something hardened in my chest, turned sharp and focused. We would recover from this. We would rebuild. And we would do it without ever asking him for help, without ever giving him the satisfaction of being right. That night, Jonah and I sat at our kitchen table with a notebook and made plans, listing every possible way to move forward despite this setback. Jonah came home 2 weeks later with bruised hands from taking extra shifts at a warehouse to make up for the lost income from his shop. His knuckles were scraped from moving heavy boxes, his fingers stained with grease and exhaustion. "We'll get out of this," he whispered as we lay in bed, his voice tired but certain. "I promise you, Yoni, we'll build something they can't steal or break or bet against." His eyes were tired, dark circles underneath from too many hours working and too few hours sleeping. But his voice carried absolute conviction, the kind of certainty that makes you believe impossible things. I believed him more than I'd ever believed anyone, not because he promised it would be easy, but because he promised we'd do it together. We started eating even simpler meals to save money. Ramen noodles became a staple. Second-hand stores became our shopping destination for everything. We canceled our internet to save $40 a month. Every penny mattered, every sacrifice counted. But we never stopped laughing during dinner, never stopped holding hands on our walks, never stopped believing that this struggle was temporary. The love that my father thought would crumble under financial pressure actually grew stronger, tempered by shared hardship into something unbreakable. My father updated his will that spring. My mother called me in tears, whispering the news like it was a shameful secret. "He's taken you out of it completely," she said, her voice breaking. "He says you made your bed and now you have to lie in it. I'm so sorry, sweetheart. I tried to talk to him, but he won't listen." I thanked her for telling me and asked her not to call for a while. I needed space from the constant reminders of his disappointment and rejection. That night, Jonah kissed my forehead and said quietly, "Let's make something no one can erase. Let's build a legacy that doesn't depend on inheritance or approval." His words planted a seed that would eventually grow into everything we became. Being written out of the will should have devastated me, but instead, it felt like freedom. I no longer had to wonder if maintaining some relationship with my father was worth it for future financial security. That question was answered. I was completely on my own, and that clarity was almost liberating. Whatever we built would be entirely ours, earned through our own work and sacrifices, untainted by my father's money or conditional love. Jonah started tinkering with an idea around this time, working on it during late nights after his warehouse shifts ended. a software tool designed to help small businesses automate their accounting without expensive programs or accountants. He'd seen the need while running his repair shop, the way small business owners struggled with financial management and couldn't afford professional help. He spent nights at our kitchen table sketching code on napkins, filling notebooks with ideas and algorithms. I handled the financial planning side, using the business knowledge I'd gained from my father's dinner table conversations over the years. We made a good team, his technical skills and my business sense combining into something potentially powerful. We named it Lumen, after the light we never stopped chasing even in our darkest moments. The apartment became our workshop. The dining table was covered in papers and laptops. Our bedroom door had sticky notes with reminders and code snippets. We barely slept, working our day jobs and then coming home to work on Lumen until midnight or later. It was exhausting, but it gave us purpose beyond just surviving. We were building something, creating something, making a future with our own hands. I ran into my father at the grocery store on a Saturday morning about a year after my wedding. I almost didn't see him in the produce section, but then we were face to face across a display of apples. He looked me up and down slowly, taking in my cheap sweater with a small hole in the sleeve, my scuffed shoes I'd worn for 2 years, my lack of jewelry or expensive accessories. "Still playing house," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. The words were casual, but the judgment behind them was heavy. He meant, still pretending poverty is romantic, still clinging to your mistake, still too proud to admit you were wrong. All those questions packed into 3 dismissive words that tried to reduce my marriage and my life to a child's game. I smiled faintly, refusing to let him see how much the encounter rattled me. "Yes," I replied clearly. "And it's real." 2 words to counter his 3, an affirmation instead of his question, a statement of fact instead of his judgment. He walked away shaking his head like I was a lost cause. I stood there in the produce section, pulse pounding, too proud to let him see the tears threatening to spill. But my hands shook as I picked out apples, and I left the store without finishing my shopping list. A small tech shop bought our software for $2,000 3 months later. It was our first real sale, our first proof that Lumen was more than just a dream scratched on napkins. The check arrived in the mail on a Tuesday, and we stared at it for a full minute before the reality set in. Someone had paid us real money for something we created. We danced barefoot in our living room that night, laughing through tears of relief and joy. The neighbors below probably thought we were crazy, stomping and spinning to music only we could hear. Jonah lifted me off my feet and spun me around until we were both dizzy and breathless. It wasn't just a sale. It was proof we could win quietly, could build something valuable without my father's help or approval. That $2,000 meant more than the amount itself. It meant validation. It meant our late nights had purpose. It meant poverty wasn't permanent. We deposited the check and immediately reinvested most of it back into Lumen, buying better equipment and software licenses. We kept just enough to buy a decent dinner out, our first restaurant meal in months that wasn't fast food. We toasted with cheap wine and felt like millionaires. Several months later, my mother called with news that made my stomach drop. "He's sick, Yoni," she said, her voice trembling. "Your father had a stroke. He's in the hospital. Please come visit." Her pleading tone made it clear how serious the situation was. Despite everything, he was still my father, still the man who taught me to ride a bike and helped me with homework when I was young. I hesitated, torn between old loyalty and new wounds. My mother begged, crying openly now. When I finally arrived at the hospital, my father was awake but weak. I stood in the doorway of his room, waiting. He looked at me for a long moment, then turned his face to the wall. "I don't need pity from someone who sold her pride for poverty," he said, his voice weak but venomous. I left without saying a word, walking down the hospital corridor with my mother calling after me. But I didn't turn back. In the parking lot, I sat in my car for 20 minutes, gripping the steering wheel and crying angry tears. Even from a hospital bed, reduced by illness, he couldn't let go of his judgment and disappointment. Some wounds cut too deep to heal, some words hurt too much to forgive. Lumen began to take off over the following year. Small businesses started recommending it to each other. The software solved real problems, saved people real time and money. Word spread through business networks and online forums. Investors started calling, interested in what we were building and how fast it was growing. Our little apartment became too small for the operation. Jonah still wore the same worn jacket he'd owned when we got married, coding through the night at our kitchen table while I handled licensing agreements and legal paperwork. We were exhausted constantly, running on coffee and determination. But we were also thriving in ways that had nothing to do with money. We were partners in every sense, building something together that neither of us could have created alone. One night, after closing a deal with a major client, Jonah whispered to me in bed, "Someday, I'll make enough money to buy your father's company just to return it to you as a gift." I laughed softly at the fantasy, but part of me loved the fierce loyalty behind the ridiculous promise. He would fight dragons for me if dragons existed. Instead, he fought poverty, skepticism, and long odds. My father's health worsened over the next few months. I visited again when my mother called crying, saying he might not have much time left. This time, he was asleep when I entered his hospital room, his face pale against the white pillows. I stood there for a moment, looking at this man who'd shaped so much of my life, for better and worse. I left a note on his nightstand where he'd see it when he woke up. The words came easily, without anger or pain, just simple truth. "Even without your blessing, I built the life you said I couldn't. I hope someday you'll understand that your approval was never what made it real." I signed it with just my name, no love or your daughter, just Yoni. He never replied to that note, never acknowledged it, but my mother told me later that he kept it in his wallet. Lumen's success made the local newspaper that fall. A small article in the business section about local entrepreneurs to watch. My father called my mother's phone the next morning after reading it. She answered with trembling hands, putting him on speaker so I could hear while I was visiting. His voice came through thin and grudging. "It's just luck. They'll lose it as fast as they made it." My mother's face fell, disappointed that even this success couldn't soften his heart. She hung up and looked at me apologetically. "He still thinks it's temporary," she said softly, trying to cushion the blow of his continued rejection. But I'd stopped expecting anything different. Jonah, sitting beside me on my mother's couch, smiled and squeezed my hand. "Let's give him something impossible to ignore," he said quietly. We opened an actual office 6 months later, moving Lumen out of our apartment and into a real business space. It was small, just 3 rooms and a converted warehouse, but it was ours. We hired 12 employees, people who believed in what we were building and wanted to be part of something growing. The first day we all gathered in our new space, I felt overwhelmed by how far we'd come. Jonah gave me the first official paycheck with a sticky note attached that read, "For every time you walked alone down that aisle." I cried at my desk, not caring that employees might see their boss breaking down. These were good tears, healing tears, the kind that wash away old wounds. The check was for more money than I'd ever earned in a month teaching piano lessons. We'd gone from barely making rent to actually thriving. That evening, we stood in our new office after everyone had left, looking around at the empty desks and computers that would hum with activity tomorrow. "We did it," I whispered, and Jonah pulled me close. "You did it," he corrected. "You walked down that aisle alone and kept walking until we got here." Lumen crossed its first $1 million in revenue the following spring. $1 million in sales from a company that had started as code on napkins in a cramped apartment. A business magazine interviewed Jonah about our success story, asking about our journey from poverty to profit. He spoke eloquently about love, partnership, and humility, about building something meaningful instead of just chasing wealth. He mentioned me by name twice during the interview, crediting my business sense and unwavering support. "My wife saw the vision before I did," he said in the published article. "She believed when belief was all we had." When the magazine arrived in the mail, I read those words and felt something heal inside me. I was seen, valued, appreciated in ways my father never understood. I mailed a copy of the magazine to my parents with no note attached. No gloating, no commentary, just the evidence of what we'd built. My mother called the next day to say it had arrived. "Your father read it 3 times, she said quietly. "He didn't say anything, but he kept reading it." Silence was something, at least. Not approval, but acknowledgement. My cousin texted me a few days later with gossip from a family gathering I hadn't been invited to. "Your dad showed the magazine to his friends at dinner last night," she wrote. But apparently he called Jonah lucky, said he was in the right place at right time with the right idea. I laughed quietly, alone in my office. Of course. My father couldn't say proud, couldn't acknowledge skill or hard work, had to reduce everything to luck. The text continued, but honestly, Yoni, he looked sad when he said it, like he knows he's missing something. I didn't reply, just set my phone down and got back to work. Sadness was his to carry, not mine to fix. I'd spent enough years trying to earn his pride. Now I had my own accomplishments to focus on, my own life to build, my own definition of success that had nothing to do with his approval. Forbes magazine called on a Tuesday morning in June. They wanted Jonah for a cover feature, an article about innovation and entrepreneurship titled From Repair Shop to Revolution. The editor explained they'd been following Lumen's growth and wanted to highlight Jonah's journey as an example of American ingenuity and determination. It was the kind of recognition most entrepreneurs only dream about. Jonah looked at me after hanging up the phone, his expression somewhere between shock and disbelief. "This is for every person who thought we couldn't," he said quietly. "Everyone who measured our worth by our bank account instead of our character." I smiled, understanding exactly who he meant without having to name names. "Especially one person in particular," I agreed softly. The photo shoot happened 3 weeks later in our office, with professional lighting and makeup artists and a photographer who'd worked with celebrities. They dressed Jonah in an expensive suit and positioned him against a backdrop of our company logo. He looked confident and successful, every inch the visionary entrepreneur. But I saw the boy who'd fixed my radiator at midnight, who'd held me while I cried, who'd believed in us when no one else did. The Forbes issue hit newsstands on a Monday morning in August. My cousin, the one who kept me updated on family gossip, was in an airport when she spotted it. She sent me a video she'd secretly recorded from across the terminal. My father was sitting in the business class lounge, reading a newspaper. He glanced up and saw the magazine rack, saw Jonah's face under the Forbes logo and the headline, "The Innovator Who Built Light from Nothing." In the video, my father dropped his coffee cup. It shattered on the floor, dark liquid spreading across expensive tile, but he didn't seem to notice. He just stared at that magazine, his face going pale and then red. He grabbed a copy from the rack with shaking hands, unfolded it, and stood there reading while airport staff cleaned up the spilled coffee around his feet. He didn't say a word, just folded the magazine carefully and walked away, his shoulders slumped. My cousin added her own commentary to the text. "I've never seen him look so defeated, like he realized he bet on the wrong horse and the race is over." I watched that video 3 times, feeling complicated emotions I couldn't quite name. Not triumph, not exactly. Maybe vindication. Maybe sadness for what could have been if he'd just chosen differently from the start. Days later, my mother called. Her voice was quiet, almost scared. "He wants to see you, Yoni. Will you come?" I didn't answer immediately. Part of me wanted to refuse, to let him sit with his regret the way I'd sat with his rejection. But curiosity won out. I wanted to hear what he'd say now that the narrative he'd written for my life had been completely overturned. When I walked into my parents' house, my father stood up slowly from his chair. He was holding that same Forbes magazine, creased from multiple readings. His hands trembled slightly. "I was wrong," he whispered, and those 3 words seemed to cost him everything. "About Jonah, about your choices, about what makes a life worthwhile." His voice cracked on the last word. I nodded slowly. "You were," I agreed simply. No forgiveness offered, no reconciliation implied, just acknowledgement of truth. He tried to step forward, tried to hug me like we were father and daughter again, like years of pain could be erased by 3 words. But I stepped back, maintaining the distance he'd created on my wedding day. "You don't get to walk me anywhere now," I said quietly. "I learned to walk alone." A month later, Forbes sent us a framed copy of the magazine issue. The cover looked powerful and professional, Jonah's face confident under that headline about building light from nothing. We hung it in our main office where employees and clients could see it. I stood there staring at the reflection in the glass, seeing myself standing beside the man the world was calling a visionary. My father never attended another of my milestones after that visit. No birthdays, no company celebrations, no holidays. He'd extended his olive branch once, and when I didn't accept it on his terms, he retreated back into his wounded pride. But I no longer needed him too. The validation I'd spent my whole life seeking from him had become irrelevant once I learned to validate myself. The same aisle he'd refused to walk me down had turned into a runway I'd built myself, step by difficult step. It led exactly where I was meant to go, toward a life of my own making with a partner who valued me completely. Sometimes I thought about that wedding day, about walking alone in my second-hand dress while guests whispered. But now when I remembered it, I didn't feel shame. I felt proud. That walk had been my first step toward everything I became. My father's rejection, meant to diminish me, had actually freed me to become more than he ever imagined possible. And that, more than any magazine cover, was the real victory.